this session is one of the part of the second international conference on environmental peace building. This is a very big conference for taking for the 4 days, and the 74th session is included. So it is a very wide international conference. We are very happy to organize this session today. And thank you very much for all audience. At this moment, we are recorded for the 28 participants here, but in the registration basis, we receive more than 150 persons registered for this session. It is one of the biggest one. So I'm very happy to organize this session. And today, we are discussing about human security and climate change in Asia. Needless to say, Asia is one of the growth center in the world, and many people enjoy for the development and also the growth. However, due to the expansion of the populations, individual basis, there are so many difficult things may happen, especially due to the influence of climate change. People's way of life may change significantly right now, and also in the future, we may face with a much more difficult situation. So in this regard, today, we want to have this session, how climate change affects human security situation in Asia. So, and due to the number of the participants, we try our best to make it for a more dialogue basis, but I want to explain about the program itself. Could you upload the PowerPoint for the program? Yes, thank you very much. Today, we have 4 speakers, Professor Brendan Howe, UFA Women's School, Women's University, and the Dean, Graduate School of International Studies, and Professor Oscar Gomez, Peacemaker Asia Pacific University, and Mr. Anselm Vogler, IFSH, Institute of Peace Research and Security Policy, Hamburg, and Professor Mikio Ishiwatari, University of Tokyo, and coordinated by Natalia and Christian. Next page, please. Time slot for today is starting for this opening. We will allocate for the 70 minutes each for each presentation. And then we will have the 20 minutes for the discussion. This is your time frame for today. Next slide, please. I ask you, this is a reminder from the organizer of this international conference. One is harassment. Please refrain from harassment. And if you find out some kind of harassment issues, please contact to the address below for the conference at environmentalpeacebuilding.org and the person who are in charge for this matter. And this is a reminder for the harassment. And the next page, please. One more point is the mutual respect and collaboration. We expect for the all audience to respect for the mutually and enjoy and try to encourage your collaboration on this session. Next slide, please. And house rule for this session. For the time, please keep all the audience to keep your microphone to mute. And please accept this session will be recorded by the organizer and uploaded to the conference website after the conference. Please refrain from personal recording and photo taking. And during the organization of discussion, if you have any question or comment, please write in Q&A box. You can start anytime from now. And also, please make sure to include name of the speaker to whom you want to ask a question. And also, please write down your name and organization if you can. But please make sure there are so many questions may come arise. That's why your question make more simple and brief in order to all of us to catch your questions. And please accept if the many questions come up, we may not answer all questions, but we try our best to organize this session more interactively. Thank you very much. So, so we will start from Professor Brendan Howe. I expect your presentation. Brendan is addressing about the diverse nature of the Asia. It is very easy to discuss about the Asia as a whole. However, individually, each country has different challenges. So Brendan explained about the overall feature of the Asian countries, showing about the individual cases, and also explained about the implications about the overall impact on this relationship. So Brendan, floor is yours. Please enjoy your time.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to the organizers. I will be very brief and leap straight into this as we only have a very short time for presentation. So hopefully my slides will show okay. So I'm actually going to be talking about conflict development and the environment in East Asia, which is one, the area of my research, but two, I think perhaps the most important part of Asia when it comes to the spillover between these concepts. Because East Asia, and I include the subregions of both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, has been viewed as ranking among the most conflictual regions on the planet. International governance initiatives have focused on non-intervention and order rather than justice, while domestic governance has emphasized national interest and strength in terms of security, but also economic growth. And in many ways, this regional security regime would seem to be very successful. Throughout East Asia, a premium has been placed on economic development, with rapid success in this field, combined with high levels of industrialization, urbanization, and mobilization across the board. And this focus has also been termed econophoria, where all the region's problems, those who govern seek to solve these problems through economic development. But of course, major challenges to human security endure in this region, some of which have been exacerbated by the supposed successful development policies focusing on industrialization, urbanization, and modernization. Among the most serious challenges are, of course, environmental degradation, but also natural disasters, which due to the impact of human agency should perhaps be termed natural induced disasters, and a variety of other human security challenges, each of which individually threaten the lives and well-being of the most vulnerable. Additionally, however, through the interaction between these different factors, they can also serve as insecurity multipliers. So insecurity and underdevelopment can stimulate unsustainable development practices that not only lead to environmental degradation, but can also increase disaster vulnerability, as well as lead to intrastate resource conflicts, all of which threaten the human security of the most vulnerable. The relocation of often already vulnerable and marginalized local populations to make way for developmental mega projects, such as hydroelectric dams, can further undermine human security. Infrastructure development can increase vulnerability to traffic accidents, to human trafficking, and to the degradation of the local environment in terms of drinkable water and breathable air. So I'm going to look at a number of case studies throughout the region, starting with one that's geographically closest to me here in Seoul, North Korea. Here I'm going to look at national insecurity and human insecurity and the spillover between them. The successive administrations in Pyongyang have used the supposed hostile international operating environment within which North Korea finds itself to foster a belief in the need for or justification of policies that further undermine human security among the most vulnerable of their citizens. Foremost among these policies are Juche, self-reliance, Songun, military first, as well as the successor policy under Kim Jong-un of Byungjin, parallel development of energy and nuclear weapons. These misguided attempts at self-sufficiency, independence, and national strength building have led to shortages, underdevelopment, and human insecurity. Furthermore, since 2019, bad weather, poor harvests, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the government countermeasures to the COVID-19 pandemic, have exacerbated food insecurity in the DPRK. The country is at high risk of natural disasters, especially floods, but also ironically droughts in recent years. Meanwhile, spending on the military has diverted funds essential for protection and promotion of human security to these military and developmental projects. This, of course, has also been the experience of my second case study, which is Myanmar. The national security focus and military dominance in Myanmar have distorted budgetary allocations, leaving little for human-centered development or for resilience building in the face of natural disasters. In fact, Myanmar is highly vulnerable to natural disasters. On average, there are 10 natural or nature-induced disasters impacting 125,000 people every year. Natural disasters lead to human and economic losses with the potential to have long-term impact on the national economy, in turn leading to a new generation of vulnerable extreme poor. The extreme poor need resources to survive and often resort to short-term, desperate, and unsustainable measures which degrade the natural environment. This degraded environment in turn increases vulnerability to natural disasters. So a vicious cycle there. Of all the natural disasters that have impacted Myanmar in recent years, Cyclone Nargis was the most powerful. It devastated parts of the country in May 2008, affecting more than 50 towns and leaving more than 140,000 people dead and 2.4 million people made more vulnerable due to the loss of property and livelihoods. Underlying governance failures and long-term trends leading up to Nargis left the country and its citizens even more vulnerable to the devastating impact of the storm. The pre-disaster struggle for survival among the most vulnerable communities had further resulted in overexploitation of the environment and unsustainable natural resource management. In fact, investigations blamed the magnitude of the disaster squarely on the human impact on the environment, in particular, the deforestation of mangroves, which would previously have provided a natural barrier to storm surge. In addition, if we look at the track taken by Cyclone Nargis, it wasn't the normal track. It wasn't the track that Myanmar is used to dealing with when it comes to cyclones. And again, this is believed to have been caused by global climate change. So Myanmar has been ranked as one of the 3 countries most affected by climate risk. Deforestation contributed to the severity of the 2015 floods and landslides, but it can also contribute to drought, the natural hazard seen by some as ultimately an even greater threat to Myanmar's resilience. We move on to Laos. I'm conscious, by the way, I'm going through this very quickly. I hope that everyone is keeping up. I'm trying to keep to the time limit. The government in Laos is focused almost to the point of obsession on transitioning from being landlocked to becoming land-linked, or a crossroads for trade. Furthermore, implementation of large-scale public infrastructure projects at the macro level, often in partnership with neighboring countries, has been the focus of the government's National Development Plan. And these projects have typically been in the form of either hydropower projects to generate electric power and revenue, or commercial exploitation of land to boost growth. These macroeconomic projects, pursued with international partners, have the potential negatively to impact on both human security and environmental considerations. Either human needs are neglected because of the prioritization of macroeconomic policies, or they are sacrificed for the collective good. Threat to aquatic biodiversity and fishery productivity, as well as people's livelihoods, are the natural consequences of hydroelectric dams. The Mekong Delta faces the 3 big challenges of climate change, unsustainable development, and these hydropower plants. Similar threats to the environment and human security of the most vulnerable, generated by regime insecurity and econophoric macroeconomic developmentalism, can be found throughout the region. From developed countries, in the more developed countries, from China to Vietnam, as well as in the final case study I'm going to address, that of Malaysia. So it's not just the extreme poor countries that are vulnerable in this way. Development policies in Malaysia have been geared towards moving the country from an agricultural-based nation to an industrialized nation. Again, hydroelectric dams are among the biggest offenders. Thousands of indigenous people have been displaced, hundreds of square kilometers flooded. The problems of indigenous communities have been exacerbated by Malaysia's land policy that does not uphold native land tenure or native customary rights land. There's been extensive damage to and hardship upon livelihood and survival of communities within the zones earmarked for community relocation and resettlement. These negative impacts include the creation of boom and bust towns, inflation, the impact on navigation capacities, community livelihood, as well as unfair compensation. The irreversible destruction of tens of thousands of hectares of forest ecosystem has, of course, had a major impact on the ecosystem, but also has led to massive greenhouse gas emission, especially carbon dioxide and methane arising from the microbial decomposition of submerged forest, vegetation, wildlife, and soil. Dammed water is also prone to the proliferation of algae, which, if left unattended, leach oxygen from the water, bring about a state of hypoxia. So as a result of their conflictual heritage, many Asian states have focused on state-centric security and development models. The non-interventionary nature of international relations and organizations in Northeast and Southeast Asia has made it difficult to address the life-threatening impact of transborder yellow dust in Northeast Asia or haze in Southeast Asia. Human insecurity and environmental degradation have driven migrants and refugees across international borders, and this has challenged national or even international security perspectives of neighboring states. So there's a non-hierarchical, even circular causality operating in East Asia, whereby the national development or security focus causes threats to human security, which cause unsustainable development practices, which cause national development and security threats, which cause a national development security focus. So we need to look at how we can break this circular insecurity causality. And I think, first of all, we need to recognize that only holistic governance approaches can hope to deal with the complex web of causality and insecurity addressed in this presentation. We're starting to look at this in terms of the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, or HDPN. But I think that what we need to do is take more of a small h, small d, small p, small n perspective. So the key message and avenue for further research is how can holistic approaches to the HDPN prioritize bottom-up, human-centric engagement and empowerment of local communities rather than national engagement. And that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. At this moment, we don't have any direct question to you, but from me, I want to ask about your comment about just Asian countries so diverse. So it is very difficult to conclude or to make one point to summarize about all difficulties. However, how do you think about the relationship between the national security and human security? As you said, you have mentioned many Asian countries, but not limited to the Asian country, has a mainly focusing on national security, but the addressing for the human security is quite important. how we could make to raise awareness about human security in policy. Do you have any suggestion or idea on this point?
Actually, I think this is one of the great hopes for the region, is that actors, starting of course with Japan's emphasis on human security, but also South Korea, which has avoided using the term human security until the current administration, because the Japanese used it first. But I think there's a great deal of opportunity for second-tier powers in the region, whether they be considered middle powers or some other description, to provide regional leadership on a human-centered focus to the HDPN. And this may also help them collaborate with each other, because one, it's in their national interest to do so, because they'll get more bang for their buck than trying to engage in geostrategic competition with the great powers. And two, because as it's been identified as an area of niche diplomacy, it's easier to cooperate on these small HDPN levels than on the large HDPN.
Okay. Thank you very much. There's one question or comment from two questions. One is from IGS, Binaya. Somewhat agreed, somewhat cannot agree, because humans, you have not mentioned, you have not shown any positive outlook due to this intervention. This is a comment from Binaya, and the other comment is for the Subiba. Myanmar's recent military control changed the hope for the country's sustainability effort and human security. Do you have any comment on this point?
Yes, I think I can respond to both of these. First of all, with regard to Laos, now at the aggregate measurement of development, in fact, all aggregate measurements of development, including human development aggregation, Laos has been a remarkable success story in raising GDP per capita, GNI per capita, and also human security measurements. So I have not ruled these out. In fact, in my extensive publications on Laos, I do address the macroeconomic as well as the aggregate measurements of success. The problem is, and this is actually across the board in Asia, that the focus is on aggregate measurements. So even if you are successfully going from a least developed country status to a middle income status, as Laos has done, even if you are able to join the WTO, two of the major aspirations of Laos, the most vulnerable are quite often sacrificed in terms of the aggregate gain. And very often in these countries, it's actually minorities that are relocated to make way for the hydroelectric dams, for instance. So that's what I'm trying to draw attention to, is that I'm not saying we shouldn't develop. Development is also good, but it's not automatically a panacea. So we need to focus on equitable development in terms of shares of the collective good, but also shares of the collective bad, that no one group or number of individuals are sacrificed for the collective gain. In terms of Myanmar, I've also done quite a lot of work on Myanmar, and both before the transition to democratization, during the transition to democratization, and after. In terms of, I see lots of questions coming, I'm trying to keep up with these. In terms of human security, when I met with Aung San Suu Kyi, actually before she came to power, I was there somewhat illegally interviewing her. She said that one of her big concerns were the environmental challenges, human security environmental challenges posed by the development efforts of multinational corporations. And she actually singled out South Korean corporations as well as Chinese corporations for their negative impact on human security through development. Of course, when the National League for Democracy came to power, they did make some progress on environmental issues, but given that the worst atrocities against the Rohingya were carried out under the NLD administration, even if they were not directly responsible for them, they certainly didn't put an end to them. I think it's too much to say that the NLD actually turned around human insecurity in Myanmar. In fact, the expenditure as a proportion of the budget was still dramatically focused on the military, even under the NLD. And now, of course, that the NLD have been overthrown and the military are back in command, and we're actually approaching a civil war now in Myanmar, everything is getting worse again. I've got a couple more questions here. Is there any initiative from Asian countries to address this climate insecurity collectively? Well, of course, in Korea, we do have the Global Green Growth Institute, which is a UN body, but it was actually set up by Korea a couple of administrations ago. Moving swiftly on, do countries that mentioned in your presentation, do they recognize the link between climate change and security beyond human security? Yes, they do, or certainly some people there do. The Cyclone Nargis data that I was able to collect in Myanmar was actually from the chief government advisor at the time, who recognized these dangers and was trying to promote this to the people, but the government wouldn't let him. So he was unable to warn the people. So this is why the emphasis must be on the accessibility of first responders, and education and training. And okay, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for summing up your answering for your questions. So now the time is up. So we will move on to the next speakers. But we can encourage for the audience, if you have keep asking questions to Brendan, please upload your questions. So he will answer most of the questions on the discussion part. So thank you very much, Brendan. So now move on to Oscar. Oscar is addressing about the issue of the migration or movement, population movement. It may cause a very big implication on the regions. So he will address about how population movement with how we could recognize and capture about the issue of population movement in the context of climate change and human security agenda in Asia. So Oscar, now is your turn. Please.
Thanks very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for coming. Today is very simple what I want to talk about. I want to give you an overview of how we should conceive or how much we know about migration in connection with disaster and climate change in the region. The importance of doing this is because, as you may know, from the very beginning of conversations on the environment and on climate change, migrants have had a very odd position in the discussion. They have been used as a cautionary tale that if we don't protect the environment, or if we do not mitigate climate change, then there will be hordes of zombies coming out and they will destabilize the world, and then we will have conflict. And you can find that in the 1977 with the world population trends, and you can find this also in the beginnings of climate change by UNEP in 1985 with the Environmental Refugees Report, starting this framing of migration as a threat of something that will come and hurt us if we don't do something about climate change. But this was a little bit odd in the beginning because, you know, I mean, the humans have been migrating around the planet for 200,000 years in order to adapt to climate. So a little bit crazy, but tell us something about how the world has been changing all these years. And however, when the discussion on climate change started to move into not only mitigation, but also adaptation, there was a need to say, okay, so are these migrants are going to come all the way? Will they destabilize the world? What's going to happen? And that's kind of the conversation that I have reviewed and I would like to share with you today. So basically what I try to do is based on the experience of Asia I try to review the evidence about how much we know about the connection, the nexus between migration, climate change, and disasters. And for this presentation, I try to suggest some implications for the idea of environmental peace. This is a chapter that was already published last year in a book, and I think I shared the opportunity with Brendan and Mikio. And so if you're interested, you can read the full piece. I try to have a human security approach, but I do not have time to explain what are all the implications of have a human security approach. Next week, the UNDP is launching a new report on human security. I help in the drafting of this report. So if you have time, you can check that and get to learn a little bit more about what's going on human security. But what I have to say is that I try to identify at least 3 different ways through which population movements, migrants, have been linked to the conversation to climate change and disasters. First, as I just mentioned, as a threat in the future, something that they will happen and will destabilize the world. Second, something rather new that came with the idea of adaptation, like migration being a way to adapt to the effects of climate change and disasters. And finally, something that is even newer and that I will argue that requires more attention from us is that we have to understand not migration by migrants and different types of migrants and how they are affected by climate change and disasters. The sources of this literature review were basically based on the mechanisms that Martin has mentioned about the possible mechanisms of migration, some linked to fast onset disasters like storm surge, flooding, and so on, and earthquakes. Also connected to a slow onset disaster like effects on livelihoods and water, and also in relation to sea level rise. Martin also mentions conflicts, but since conflict implies a double causality, that there is a climate change that generates a conflict that generates displacement, this is a little bit too fuzzy for the literature to find, and therefore I decided to leave it aside of the review. And there is not that many research, and therefore I put it aside. Even in narrowing down the review in this way, I have to tell you that it is easy to talk about Asia because there's not much published research in peer-reviewed journals trying to show actual evidence of displacement in the region connected to disasters and climate change. And interestingly, the relation between disasters not linked to climate change are also a little bit problematic because the disaster people do not talk about migrants, but about evacuations or recovery. But anyway, I will put it aside for a moment. Let me just move into the 3 framings that I identified. The first one is migration as a threat. What we can find is that there's evidence that people move after fast onset disasters, and it happens in mass for big disasters like the Indian Ocean tsunami, Typhoon Yolanda in Bangladesh. You can see the same in Vietnam and Bangladesh, but most of the time people just come back some days or some months after. So this is not permanent migration most of the time. The only example outside of this trend is Japan after the Fukushima disaster, because it was not possible to go back to the places close to the nuclear plant. So this is the only case of internal displacement, permanent internal displacement that we see from a fast onset disaster. What we can see in the literature is that there are well-documented cases of a slow onset effects on livelihoods creating permanent displacement. These effects are indirect. We have evidence about Pakistan, Indonesia, and the Philippines connected to heat stress And we have examples of livelihoods affectations in Nepal, Bangladesh, India, Cambodia, and Thailand. And if you're gonna see the references, they are all included in the chapter. About sea level rise, well, there's not much evidence about sea level rise happening and resulting in displacement, and therefore is still an issue of speculation inside the literature. But what is expected is if that happens, it will happen like in a slow onset effect, that little by little, you find no other option but to move, not a fast onset disaster in which all of a sudden you have to run. So the common observation here is that it's mostly local and it's a slow onset phenomena. This is something that the World Bank has also documented more recently. This was not included in my review, but if you wanna, you can check the Groundswell report from last year, and you will find somehow the same observations by the World Bank. The second frame is the frame of adaptation. Well, let's think about how people actually is moving in order to adapt to climate change and disasters. And here, a lot of the research that I just presented overlaps, so I won't go again through those trends, but I want to mention what Warner and Afifi, which were linked to with the United Nations University Environment and Human Security Institute in Bonn in Germany. They have a big project in trying to document how adaptation was going on, how work in practice for people that are actually moving nowadays, migrants. And they try to identify 4 types of movements. The first, people that just improve their resilience out of moving. Second, people that just survive, but not flourish because of movement. And they try to check also people who just start to become poorer and more vulnerable because of migration, and people that cannot move. Their observations are like this. There are a lot of people who becomes richer and flourishes because of migration, but they never recognize that this is because of climate change. There are plenty of reasons why people move around the world. The most common effect is just changes without flourishing, but also not becoming poorer. And there are examples in Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And the observation here is that the people trapped is not very common. The evidence is very mixed about who actually can move or not move in the case of pressures of the environment, or environmental pressures or disasters. The IPCC had suggested that the relationship between migration and climate change was something like in figure A, and therefore all the poor people is trapped, and people a little bit with a higher well-being will be able to move. But making this literature review, I suggest that this relationship had to be resolved, but because a lot of people do not move. And in the end, and this has some psychological reasons behind that. We are very much linked to the things that we own, and as when we own something, we usually try not to move away of those things we own, because our livelihoods depend on them. And therefore, it's only the ultra rich who actually own too many things in too many places, so they don't bother about moving, or the ultra poor who don't have anything, so they don't have any problem about moving. The ones who have actually can move, but I think that the large majority of humanity do not move because humans do not have become used to stay in some place when they own something. Besides adaptation as a frame, we have also examples about resettlement experience, and Brendan talked a little bit about this, but I won't go into detail. We have a lot of experience about these hydropower plants and dams, but this is a very sensitive issue, and usually it's not easy to include into the climate change discussion, so I will not talk about it here as well. And finally, we have a different approach to migration, and it's not migration itself, but looking at migrants. On the one hand, there is some evidence that different migrants perform different and have different types of vulnerability. So children or women may have different vulnerabilities to different situations, and therefore they may deserve a specific research. But I have to say, this is an area in which we have the less research. So these are kind of a speculation to some time. The IOM, the International Office for Migration, has been trying to promote some of this research, but as you can imagine, the pandemic destroyed all of this, because now nobody can move anywhere and we have to do all online. So not quite sure how important it's going to be in the future. But there was some evidence, and some people in Bangladesh, Japan, Thailand, and Turkey presenting some research about different types of vulnerability during disasters. And you can see that we have seen a new trend about evacuations about disaster. Perhaps you remember at the beginning of this pandemic that people were being evacuated out of China because of the pandemic. They supposed they could stop it, but they couldn't. Anyway, evacuations are going to be an important topic for the future. And the experience of Philippines is also marvelous about this thing, but we need more research about this. And the second trend that we see inside migrants is that migrants are not only vulnerable populations, they are providers of security through remittances, through knowledge. And we have data, for example, in Nepal, in the earthquake in Nepal, how when you have the earthquake, remittances do not go down, they go a little bit up because they try to help people back home. And therefore, migrants have also an important role to play when there is instability for any reason anywhere in the world. And I think COVID has been not different here. So in sum, I present three frames that we can find in the literature: migration as a threat, migration as a means, and migrants as in the middle of climate change and disasters. And they offer in different points of view. The threat is still being common. You still see a lot of people talking about migrants as a threat, but some recognition that this is not an international threat, is mostly a local threat that comes from slow onset disasters, means migration as a way of adaptation had gathered a lot of attention in last, 10 years ago, but that is coming down, as you know, because now we cannot move anywhere. So very difficult to use migration as adaptation. And I suggest that focusing on how migrants perform is a new way of addressing the situation. So I want to close with some implications for environmental peace building, which is the main topic of this conference. So first, population movement probably contribute, but they are a very minor factor among the complexities of conflict. And it's mostly a local situation, so it will be relevant only for local conflicts. And even in that case, there are so many complexities and so many factors that it's not quite sure how much a contribution they are. And we need more observation and analysis, because still we have very few solid data-grounded meaningful research. So we still require much more publication and analysis. What I think, but what we can do and we must do at this stage is try to countering the narrative of migrants being a threat, because that's dehumanizing, and something that COVID has shown us is how easy it is to stigmatize migrants and turn into xenophobic behaviors in societies, and has happened all over the world. So if I had one suggestion for environmental peace building people, will be to avoid such stereotypization or such stigmatization of migration. And that's all. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Oscar. You are explaining comprehensively about the importance and the seriousness about the migration cause. And I realize about how it will affect for the disaster situation and also the further conflict. And also, I'm thinking about economic growth accelerate the utilization of the land, and also it may cause for the more vulnerable against for the disaster. And also, I'm wondering about the question on the how the living standard of migrant peoples. I mean, for the social safety net is also one of the agendas that we had to address. And so it is not easy to sum it up for your point, but one point I would like to ask is in which area you have most interest for your further question, further research or topic. There's so many issues within migration. There are so many issues coming up, and also the diversity in Asian countries. Do you have any special topic or interest that you want to study further?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think that the pandemic changed this topic drastically. I have some interest before the beginning of the pandemic, but now we have something that we haven't experienced before. If you see the migration studies, all people is crazy because, I mean, all the literature on migration was about the vulnerability of these people left behind and migration being and migrants being discriminated and not being put into the agenda. But now there are no migrants, no international migrants. So I believe that we have to keep observing and see what's going to be the evolution of how the pandemic will change the behavior. I mean, and here in Japan, we are just in a very, I mean, the country is closed. It's been closed for 2 years. So I think that the behavior, how the conception of migrants will change because of the pandemic and their effects on peace building is what's going to keep migrant experts busy for the coming years.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to ask many questions, but due to the time constraint, I will move on to the next speakers. Ansem, now is your turn. Ansem is arguing about the perception of the security, climate securities. It is also mentioning about the difficulty of how we could capture about the issue of the climate issues among many organizations. So Ansem, now is your turn. Floor is open to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear and see me and see my slides and everything's fine. I see nodding. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And I think, first of all, I should express my gratitude to the organizers of the conference. Thank you very much for organizing it. Thanks also for the kind host of the panel. Thank you to the administrators, to the technical staff. I'm very happy to be here and to be on this panel. And I want to use the opportunity to talk about the perception of climate insecurity in NDC submissions. This talk relates to the previous two talks we have heard in several ways that will become clear, I guess. We have already heard how different approaches to security lead to very different outcomes in Southeast Asian countries. And we also heard just in the last talk, how framing climate migration in different ways has very different impacts for those affected by it. So, and I want to build on that with one more contribution about framing. And you all are experts on all these related issues in one or another way. So I don't want to spend too much time on the theoretical starting points, just maybe so much whether climate change should be approached as a security issue certainly depends on many aspects. One of them is how we define climate security or security itself. It is much more convincing to think about human security or environmental security than to think about climate change as an issue of national security. And the second important starting point for me is that policy really matters. Policy affects climate security. Research has found that good institutions, that climate mitigation, climate adaptation are proper remedies, or in fact, hopefully proper remedies to address potential insecurities stemming from climate change. And the choice of policies, in turn, depends to a large extent on how we frame the problem. If climate change is framed as a security issue in given ways, it highlights, it justifies one policy or another policy. So framing really matters because it affects policy, and policy in turn affects whether we will have to deal with, or in the extent in which we will have to deal with climate-related insecurities. So, and there is concern that climate securitization could advocate unsustainable solutions, and this got me going, so to speak. I am looking into climate security framings, and I'm curious about the frames that they present about climate change. My research question in this regard is first how civil framings of climate security are emerging and being established, and to put them into context, I compare them to the somewhat older framings of climate as a security issue presented in publications of defense ministries. So I'm comparing the framing of climate security in civil and in defense ministries. For that, I conducted two content analyses, the already announced NDCs, but on the other hand, I conducted a second content analysis of what I call national security strategy documents, which is just my term to compile different documents published by ministries of defense under similar names like White Books of Defense or National Security Strategy or similar terms. And these documents outline how the defense ministries of countries perceive security issues, and among them also climate change. And I collected as many documents as I could of these two categories, but with one important limitation. In order to control for country effects, I am only integrating documents from countries that have published both kinds of documents. And this together sums up to documents from 39 countries. Of course, there are more countries that have submitted NDCs, or also more countries that have published security strategy documents, but most other countries have not published them as a publication of the defense ministry, but rather of the whole government. And in that regard, I excluded them, as I said, in order to really be able to differentiate between what defense ministries frame versus what coalitions of civil ministries who are involved in writing the NDC are framing, saying in terms of framing climate security. I took those documents and I conducted a primary and a secondary analysis. The primary analyses are just simple inductive content analyses. I clustered statements to extract typical framings of climate as a security issue, and then I moved on to a secondary analysis of this list of found frames. And that secondary analysis I guided by 5 categories that I came up with in order to compare between these two groups of documents. And those are the 5 features that I have been comparing the documents in, but I don't want to say too much in detail about the categories now. Rather, I would like to show you the results one by one, and while going through the results, I can also say some more words about what these different categories actually mean. The first category is the degree of differentiation. And here in this slide, you see a list of the typical statements related to climate as a security issue in national security strategy documents. These are common statements issued by defense ministries regarding climate change. And I clustered them, and I found that there are 26 typical statements in these documents. On the other hand, this table shows 45 typical statements, and those are the typical statements related to climate security in NDCs. So I would argue that the way in which NDCs refer to climate security is more differentiated than the way we find in the publications of defense ministries. And feel free to bring up more questions about these two tables in the Q&A section. I don't want to go into too much detail here. The second finding compares how these two types of documents refer to agency. And I'm differentiating between biophysical and societal agency. The guiding question here is whether the threat manifestation requires only biophysical or additional societal agency. Examples here would be between, let's say, flooding and resource conflict. Of course, flooding requires only biophysical processes, a flood, in order to take place, while resource conflict needs the involvement of many societal actors in order to be enacted, to be set on, or to maintained. And I looked at these two types of documents and what form of agency they think of when they speak of dangers to climate security. And I found remarkable differences. NDCs are really highlighting biophysical agency, and only a few NDC documents even refer to societal agency when they speak of climate insecurities. And it's a completely different picture for the publications of defense ministries. So we see here that it's very common for defense ministries to include threats that require societal agency in when they speak of climate insecurity. From that, I conclude that NSSD and NDC focus on very different dangers and threats regarding climate security. The third finding that I came up with is regarding anthropogenic origins. I looked at these documents to assess whether they refer to the anthropogenic origins of climate change. And I assume referring to them justifies different approaches than not referring to them and immediately jumping to highlighting second-order consequences. And again, I found remarkable differences because NDCs always refer to these origins, either implicitly or even more often explicitly. On the other hand, it is rare for publications of defense ministries to highlight the anthropogenic origins of climate change. They only do so in 1/3 of their documents. So, and from that, I conclude that they highlight very different intervention points. If you highlight the origins, you may be more inclined of thinking about mitigation in the first place. If you neglect them and you rather focus on societal agency in second order insecurity processes, then you are far more likely to find second order, reactive, short-sighted, selfish adaptation measures to be justified. The last two categories that I compared my two documents in are certainty and temporality. Here, my guiding question is how many of each document's frames communicate the insecurity manifestation as certain, and how many as an issue of past and present. I gladly answer to questions about how I calculated these shares in the Q&A section. But for now, I just want to say that they have about an equal share when it comes to certainty versus probability or other forms of certainty. of regarding the manifestation of climate insecurity, but again, we see differences when it comes to the, so to speak, time slot in which they expect or see or claim to see the manifestation of climate insecurity. NDCs do place the manifestation of climate-related insecurities more often in the past or present, while then defense ministries do. More often for NSSDs, climate-related insecurities are an issue of the future than for NDCs. The difference is not as overwhelming as with the other categories, but it is there. And so I would say that NDCs display a somewhat higher sense of urgency. My conclusions from this comparison is that both NSSD and NDC refer to climate security, but they warn of very different things. NDC focus much stronger on anthropogenic origins. They put higher emphasis on the urgency of the issue, and they focus on the biophysical side of the problem. They thereby advocate very different fixes than NSSD, and these two framings differ substantially regarding their sustainability. So is climate securitization advocating unsustainable solutions? More so in NSSD than in NDC framings. That's it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions now.
Thank you very much. Waiting for the question from the floor, I just want to ask about some point from my comment. You are making for the very big discovery about the difference between for the National Ministry of Defense sectors side and also civilian ministries. We consider about NDC, national document, is considered, it must be a consolidated document collecting with the overall threat, analyzing for the individual ministries. But actually, NDC and NSSD, those are produced by one country, but their analysis is quite different. It is a serious issue. How many people are addressed about such kind of different big gap coming up from those two documents? And do you have any good example who are consolidating such kind of difference, mitigating for such kind of difference within good example country who are consolidating such kind of difference? Do you have any idea? Please share it, your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So indeed, I discovered considerable differences within the documents, but also between countries. When it comes to national security strategy documents, they differ quite substantially. There are some defense ministries that are very, I would say, short-sighted and reactive in their framings. They warn of the things that Oscar were just speaking of. They are framing displaced people as the threat and the actual problem regarding to climate change. So they take a very narrow reactive approach. But there are other countries, and I may highlight with all caution here New Zealand for their defense strategy document, which is more comprehensive and who are even stating that the military is not the actor to do mitigation and that there is some need for holistic policy action. So with all caution, I can say that there is a difference in the quality in NSSD. And also with regard to the NDC, there are of course some requirements for the standardization of submitting them. There is sort of a questionnaire involved, but even within those given categories, NDCs differ a lot, and countries take the chance to refer to their or to present their take on climate security, and they do so in very different ways.
Okay, thank you very much. Very sorry about my loose time management. Time has already spent behind. So thank you very much, Ansem. So I now move on to the last speaker, Professor Mikio Ishiwatari. Mikio is mentioning about the very big challenge addressing for the issue for the peace building approaches and also the climate change approaches. It will raise very big issues. So I expect for your presentation. Mikio, now the floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for Sakane-san. And I'm very happy to be here discussing this important issue. As a panelist already pointed out various issues, so I would discuss how to resolve such a different issues from mainly from a development assistance perspective. Okay. So yeah, first, as already discussed, I say climate fragility risks. Climate fragility risks affecting various development areas. Well, already water, disaster, food, health, environment pointed out. And Oscar pointed out mitigation or livelihood are also issue. So these are a wide range of areas are affected by climate fragility risks. And this is a guiding note jointly produced by including OSCAR and the UNUIJS or IRDR, etc. So if you are interested in, please visit this document. Okay, so first I would start with my experience. So my experience in Sri Lanka, I was involved in a Japanese assistance project and peace building project, climate change project, and disaster recovery project. Well, we are implementing this project quite separately. For example, Northern Sri Lanka, Japan supported peace building after conflict between Sinhali and Tamil. They supported some rehabilitation infrastructure or community activities or livelihoods, etc. And yeah, Sri Lanka is suffering from a flood disaster, and Japan supported climate change adaptation project. They projected flood risk will increase. And thirdly, of course, supported some recovery projects from tsunami. So these are, yeah, all of these projects are related to climate fragility risks, but conducting separately, very separately. So this is actually some situation, what happening in the field of development assistance. So why it is difficult? So I summarize 3 areas: time scale, climate change adaptation. Well, Anselm mentioned well, a little bit different, but usually when we conduct some development projects for climate change adaptation, we will project future like 20 or 30 years later and consider some adaptation measures, constructing something, etc. But peace building project, usually when we go to field, we feel we have to very quickly respond to rehabilitate their lives, their community, livelihoods, etc. So it's a little bit difficult to consider such a long-term perspective, long-term issues. I mean, climate change effects, etc. Second area is risk assessment. As I said, climate change adaptation use some scientific knowledge, GCM, global models, or future prediction, simulation, flood, etc. Peace building issue usually use some analysis for society or economic situation or community situation, stakeholder, etc., etc. approach is different. And the solution, climate change adaptation, in case of flooding, like constructing something, dams, dikes, or using some technology, flood forecasting or warning, something. And peace building often use some community-based, again, societic approach, where it's also popular. So there are some very different approaches, and there are big gaps actually. So I would pick up some risk assessment. This is a JICA's approach for risk assessment, and I'm a little bit surprised. It's completely different. As I explained, climate change vulnerability analysis, they say. They analyze risks and assess capacity and vulnerability. This is for climate change. And peace building needs assessment, or it's different as peace building needs and impact assessment, they say. And yes, it covers like background, politics situation, security analysis, etc., and the stakeholder, who are the leaders, who are the community, etc. And considering some stabilizing or destabilizing such a political or tensions, etc. So these are actually very little common area. Okay, so when we manage such a climate change and conflict, yeah, everybody now we are discussing there is some link and relationship. But actually practical methods of assessing or planning, such as managing conflict, climate or fragile risks, well, it's not available for development assistance. This is the current situation. Okay, I would pick up one case in Mindanao, Philippines. Yeah, as you know, this is a very poor area because of around 20 or 30 years conflicts in Mindanao Island. And Japan supported some community development in conflicted area. This is a project supporting farmers, where this is a tomato production and good for livelihoods and recovering their communities. Another case is well, supporting farmers, aquaculture project. Well, these are, of course, successful projects and a very impactful project. But as I said, well, the priority is put on recovering their life quickly. So it's like effects by climate change from a longer term perspective is not well considered, where the project purpose is to rehabilitate, to recover their livelihoods. And at the same time, Japanese government supported climate change adaptation, flood recovery, or typhoon disaster recovery. And this is one river basin in Mindanao, and supported some climate change adaptation. There's some using some climate models. And the report says in future, flood would increase by 20% or something. And using such a scientific knowledge, not so difficult how damage will affect in future. This is the current situation, and if in future flood area will expand. Using simulation models or climate models, we can predict such things. And we can estimate how much would be damage. But currently, this is just a flood analysis and the climate change analysis. And that's why no focus on some vulnerabilities or tensions among ethnic groups or religious groups, etc. So this is just aggregated total damage estimation, but we don't know who would be vulnerable and who would be what's the political situation, religious situation, etc., ethnic groups, religious groups, economic status, etc. So when we want to manage such a climate fragility risks, we need this information also. So as such, as I explained, well, still we are struggling how to manage these both risks. So the proposed approach would be combining our practices to manage these climate fragility risks, assessing both risks and assessing their capacities and the external factors, and we can propose countermeasures. So conclusion, well, currently it's a very fragmented and not ready for managing risks. So to manage climate fragile risks, such as scientific engineering knowledge for climate change adaptation or socio-economic approach should be combined, and we need to develop such approaches. Okay, thank you very much. If you have any comments or questions, this is my email address. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I, of course, encouraging for the all audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hand or write your chat box. I encourage all of you to give some kind of comments or questions. While waiting for the questions, I asked to my personal question to Mikio. You are addressing for the relationship, I mean, for the very big different actors and agenda for the peace building arena, peace building world, and also climate change world. They are considering a different circle and try to do the approach differently. It is critically important to harnessing those two groups at once in order to protect in the future, prevent further calamity in the future. Is there any action try to harnessing those two groups or try to making for the consolidated approach? If we have any good challenge or measures that we are already taken, I want to know some kind of good lessons of connecting those two groups.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a very important and very difficult questions. Yeah, if it's a big bureaucratic organizations, well, it's not so easy to communicate like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, well, big aid agencies. So currently in some organizations, it's like a personal efforts to consider another group's ideas, another group's approaches. But I believe some organizations started to resolve, like the World Bank established such a new department, new groups, etc. So we hope we are recognizing such linkages between environment, climate, and fragility or conflicts. So we hope this would be progressing and yeah, maybe resolving further. I think Sakane-san, you may have much experience in Sudan, and you know some cases.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I'm now living in Khartoum, Sudan, and I'm doing for the, previously I'm becoming Sudan's office. I'm head of the peace building office in JICA headquarters. So in JICA is a development aid agency, and I'm conducting for the peace building approach. So the connecting for the peace building and development is critically important. And as Brendan said, in the world, HDP nexus, humanitarian development peace nexus is discussed. However, ACTA is quite different, especially for the peace building. Some others imagine about the peacekeeping operations. They are the soldiers or military aspect. Their way of the thinking and how to control conflict, and the way of the recognition of the peace building peoples, and also peace building development assistance is quite different. And also humanitarian people is thinking differently. They try to save the life, but the development is save livelihood. So the way of the approach and ACTA is quite different. So it is also very big issues. And against for the current situations, climate change also cause serious threat in the futures. And many current actors like humanitarian peace building or PKO actors or development actors thinking about now or the near future. But the climate change time span is quite different. We have to prepare for the 10 years, 20 years after. So preparedness is quite important for the several decades after. However, most of the country, and especially for the politicians thinking about the current situation, politicians had to protect. So they had to show the result right now. The climate change needs lot of concept preparation for the future. That's why collaboration between for the climate change, human security issues, or the collaboration between conflict issues, humanitarian issues, and development issues. There's so many actors work differently, so the consolidation is quite important. But today is not the presentation day for myself. I want to encourage for the all speaker to ask further questions. I mean, for the you addressing for the so many points. I mean, for the title itself is the climate change and human security in Asia, but both speakers addressing so many questions, concerns. Brenda explaining about the country difference. I mean, for the many countries have a many different kind of issues, and each country try to solve, but their way is only for the based on national-centric approach. Addressing for the human security is quite important in order to addressing for the individual persons. And Gomez is mentioning about the migration. Migration or popular people's movement could be a more threatening issue in the future, because we have to recognize about the explosion of the population in Asia. We have to prepare in the future and how this population movement affect in the future. And also we have to recognize about the coming threat of the climate change. And Ansem is also mentioning about the climate security issues. Many people is seeing differently, especially for the Ministry of Defense people see the observation of the Ministry of Defense peoples and the civil ministries people see differently. But we have to think about consolidated approach as a whole. Otherwise, we made our approach is not making for the effective result. And Mikio is mentioning about very challenging issue about the collaboration or difference between for the ordinary development process, climate change issues. Four speakers raising so many difficult questions, but I'd like to ask once again for the four speakers, what kind of measure we should take to address for such kind of difficulties? Anyone from four speakers, please speak. Brendan, you can speak. You can start.
I think, first of all, I'd like to return to the answer I gave to one of the other questions. The idea that we're not discounting the tremendous success of development and indeed peacekeeping and peace building in the East Asian region. It's remarkable that there hasn't been an outbreak of interstate war despite the conflict between them for decades. Likewise, the East Asian developmental success has been part of the reason we talk about an Asia-Pacific century. What I want to emphasize, however, is that the need for what I call the small HDPN focus instead of a large HDPN focus, that a lot of these great achievements, yes, they've been achieved at the state-centric and aggregate level, but we mustn't lose sight of the potential for negative impacts at both the individual human security level, but also potentially at the global biosphere level.
Okay, thank you very much. Mikio-san, you have your specific question from the chat box, so you will just see it and answer, but you take a time. So some other person, Gomez or Ansem, do you have any comment about how we could address such kind of challenge in the future? Gomez? Or Ansem?
Okay, yeah, no, very quickly now, I'm going to just repeat myself and say that the evidence doesn't show that migrants are going to be a major pressure into destabilization because of environmental effects. So I think that on the one hand, we require more research in order to understand what are going to be the impacts. But on the other hand, what we have to do is to stop stigmatizing and framing migration as a threat, because that can have implications in forms of xenophobia and other ways of discrimination against these type of populations.
Okay, thank you. How about Ansem?
Yes, thank you. Speaking to the stakeholders of my analysis, I think this addresses rather defense ministries than the civil ministries, but I would really advocate for appreciation of the complexity of the issues involved, and really to be aware of how complicated these interlinkages are and how much they depend on the right responses. And also, I would advocate for bridging the gap between practitioners and researchers, particularly in the defense area. There are a few studies that link or that hint to the fact that there may be a gap between research and practice. Also, I would really caution against short-sighted approaches on the defense side, and in that regard also highlight the power of framings, how framings affect solutions. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Mikio-san, could you respond to the question? And also, yes, please.
Yes, I will respond and providing my comments. Yoshi-san and Shiba-san provided some questions. Yes, and yeah, such as some segregation. We conducted some research projects under OSCAR at the JICA Institute. We call continuum. That continuum, disaster happening and the relief and the response, recovery and development. But these all phases are always not well connected. And still I'm afraid, well, improving, but still there are some such gaps between these areas. So as Sakane-san already pointed out, and these are still difficult issues, different organizations, different experts, different schemes, different fundings. So still it's not so easy to connect these phases. And as Brendan mentioned, such a small HDP. Well, yeah, I think it's a good start and a good approach. First, we should consider such a small scale, and we can scale up. This would be a very good approach, I believe. And Shiba-san's question, yes. Yeah, I was involved both such a climate change adaptation, community-based, and the peace building project, community-based. But still, they say community-based, but their approach is different still, I believe. Yeah, they are targeting communities, but peace building approach, well, it's more, how to say, more looking for some tensions or some causes, some different ethnic groups, different religions. So try to find out some roots of tensions. So it's a little bit different from like a disaster, climate-based disaster risk reduction. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Time is already up, but I will, if you want, I will give you 30 seconds for the 4 speakers. If you want to add something else, or if you want to advertise for your next event or new research, new book, I will give you 30 seconds for each speakers. Do you have anybody to say something else, something more to the audience? Yes, please, Ansem.
Maybe quite shortly, we have an upcoming panel at ISA in a month It will be digital, unfortunately, but it covers climate adaptation, and we have some very well-renowned speakers, so I can really recommend that panel. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Somebody else? Oh.
Okay, I would, yeah, as Oscar mentioned, yeah, COVID, this pandemic changes the situation. So we have to consider various risks. So yeah, I said fragility and climate risks, but we have to consider pandemic risk, disaster risk, etc. So our next approach, we should consider all hazard approach, responding to all hazard. What today we discussed. In addition, we should consider other pandemics or other economic shocks, etc. We need to consider develop further.
Thank you very much. Oscar, do you have something to say?
I was just sharing on the chat the book that just mentioned Ishiwatari-san is free access in Routledge, so anybody can just check what we did about the Nexus. It was like a 4-year project, and we did research in South Sudan, East Timor, Indonesia, Honduras, what else, and Syria as well. So, and the Philippines. So it might be interesting. And as I mentioned as well, next week, the UNDP Human Development Report Office is launching a new report on human security. You want to check the homepage and you can get some further insights about what's going on there. But thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Brendan?
No, I just want to thank everyone and look forward to future collaboration, not just with the panelists, but also with the wider audience here. I think it's been an excellent session. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you very much for all. Very sorry for my poor time management, but I enjoy very much for the session today. And I recognize about the very huge issues coming up in terms of the human climate change and human security in Asia. Further analysis will be needed, and also the collaboration and cooperation with the audience here is quite important. In this time, we are conducting this session via online, but we want to have a chance to meet each other, including for the audience, to develop our idea and want to further address about how to prevent, how to cope with the future challenges in the future. Climate change and human security in Asia is still the growing issues. We have to cope with better about the coming futures. So thank you very much for attending for the session today. And last of all, as I said in the beginning of the session, today the session is one of the components of the 4-day international conference. This conference will continue until the 4th February. You can join for the other sessions freely. So if you have an interest, please join it. And thank you very much all, including for the Natalia and Christian, and the 4 speakers and all the audience. I'd like to see the next chance to see you around. Thank you very much. So I conclude the session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Nice seeing you.